All right, today we're going to talk about soldering. Soldering is a process where you take two pieces of metal and you basically glue them together using a silver alloy that you would put between them, and that will melt, and then they will become like one piece of metal. So you can do it with multiple different types of metal. I could attach this next to it. This would be called a butt joint, where they butt up against each other. If I wanted it to stand up, it's a little more tricky. This would be a modified butt joint because there's still the butt touching this part. Or I can do what's called a lap or sweat joint. So if I want to have something that's more decorative, having one color on top of another, then this would be a lap or sweat joint because it's sitting right on top of it. Another type of butt joint would be if I'm making a ring, which I have here, these two ends butt up against each other. So those are just a couple things that you could do with soldering. Some safety things first. You have to have your hair back, if you have long hair, out of your face. You have to have safety goggles on, and any loose clothing. So if you have a scarf, a necklace, if you have really baggy sleeves, you really want to put those back. Get them out of the way. We also have an emergency fire blanket to the right of where the torch is, so you can use that in the case of an emergency if for some reason anything or anyone catches on fire. We just throw it over the top. Some things that you have to do before you actually start using the torch, because we can't just walk up with our metal and get started. You have to get a light, tight seam. So what that means is, I'll show you on the ring because it's a little easier to see. You should have the two ends touching so tightly together that you can't see light if you hold it up to the top. Now, typically with something like a ring, it's a little trickier to do this, and the way you get them to really spring next to each other is you actually push one underneath the other, kind of over and over, pushing it under, and then it builds up this little kind of pressure between the two. You can also take your steel block and you can take a mallet and you can press down on them to get a really nice even seam. So this would be a great seam for me to work with. It's pretty straight all the way across, and it connects really well. If you notice, my ring is not a circle anymore. Doesn't matter, you just solder it together and then we can put it on our ring mandrel to get the circle really perfect. Okay, so this one's ready to go. I've got my light tight seam. It's a little different when you're working with flat sheet like this. You just want to make sure they're sitting flat on top of each other, and a good trick for that is if you touch it and if you hear this, that means they're not sitting flat on top of each other. Mine are, so you really don't hear that because it's not wiggling back and forth. I just moved it off to the side to show you. So if they weren't flat, like if this one had a bend in it, what I could do is take my steel block once again and a mallet, and I can press down or hit it a couple times to get it to sit flat. But I'm ready to go. All right, the next thing that I need to do to prepare these is I have to clean them with soap and water and then dry them off. Our hands have a lot of oil in them, and so if I have that oil on the seam and then I go to try and solder, it'll act as a resist and the solder won't stick. So you just take it to the sink, soap and water, clean it off, dry it off when you're done, and then you're ready to actually start soldering. So I'm going to talk about some of the tools that you're going to need as well, so you're all ready to go. One of the first things we need is flux. So flux is in this blue jar. It is this white paste. If it ever looks like it's not really wet, you can add a little water to it. And the point of flux is to keep your metal clean. So after you've cleaned your metal, you also usually want to lightly sand your metal just so everything sticks a little better. I would take and apply my flux anywhere I want the two pieces to stick together. So in this case, I'm putting it on the back of this brass piece, and then I will put it on the front of my nickel piece that it's going to attach to. You don't need a ton, but you do need to cover any place if you want it to stick, or it will not stick. Now, while they're wet, what I can do is set down my piece, and I will put the other piece on top of it the way I want it to go. And then if I want to, since I have a lot of extra flux on here, I can go back and wipe off some of the extra, because the flux bubbles a lot, so you don't need a lot of extra. All right, so this one is all fluxed and ready to go. The metal will stay clean where it needs to. For my ring, I'm just going to put a little bit of flux on top and a little bit of flux on bottom. Okay, so that is the flux. For the next part, I'm going to talk about this brick. This is a fire reflective or a heat reflective brick. It's a soft brick, so if I press into it with my fingernails, it makes a mark. And the nice thing about this is I can actually put grooves in. You see some right here. And that's really nice if you have a ring that won't sit up well. You can kind of dig it down into the brick, and that way it will stand up the way you want to. So this is what we fire, or we've used the torch on top of. We do our soldering right on top of these. And you can take one and get prepared at your seat or off to the side while somebody else is soldering. Other tools that you're going to need, we use picks during the soldering process. This is if I need to move my solder on, if I need to move my piece around, you can, because this can go in the flame. So it's a way that you can still work while it's very hot. Some other things, we have a striker, which I'll show you when I use the torch. We have the pickle, which is our solution that keeps the metal clean after you have soldered. So it kind of removes some of the fire scale and the soot from the metal. And the striker just is your flint. It sparks and ignites the torch. And then lastly, pretty important, the solder. All right, so these are our solders. They come in these bags, and it says right on it, hard, medium, and the last one is easy. So solder comes in either sheet or wire. We typically use wire here. And when you're ready to use some, you take it out of the bag, just the ends, because we like to keep them labeled. And I'm going to snip just the tiniest piece off. You have to snip pieces that are so small that you can barely see them. So you can see there's this tiny little piece on my finger. That's how small they should be. And for a piece like this one, I'm probably going to need 5 pieces of solder. I'll put 2 on this big side, 1 on the others. And then I usually cut a few extra just because you can lose them in the process. So I'm going to pick an area like right here on my brick, and I'm going to cut like 5, probably more like 8 pieces to be dedicated for this piece. Okay. Now for my ring, it's a smaller seam, so I'm probably only going to need 2 pieces, so I'll probably cut 4 for that. So I cut my pieces, and I'm leaving them a little further away from my my piece that I'm going to solder, because I'm going to heat those at a separate time. And it's good to just add a little flux to where those pieces are too. I know you can't see them, but they're there, and I just added a little bit of flux to it. So the other thing that I should tell you about, hard, medium, and easy solder, they come in different types so that you can melt them at different temperatures. So hard is usually what you'd start with, medium would be for a second seam, and then easy would be for a third seam. So if I were going to make this and then attach it to my ring, so I have a giant detail part on top, that has multiple seams, and so I would use hard, medium, and easy as I'm creating it. So I'm basically prepped. I've got my solder, my fluxed metal, it's all cleaned and ready to go. So I'm going to take this brick to the torch, and then I will show you how to solder.